So we are live now on Preservation Maryland's Facebook page, and I'm Nick Redding. I'm the Executive Director of Preservation Maryland, and I'm super excited to be joined by a real national leader in the preservation movement and in this nation's response to what's going on all across Main Street communities, and that's Patrice Frey, the CEO and President of the National Main Street Center. And I presume I'm talking to you from Chicago, is that right?
No, I guess word hasn't gotten around. I moved back home to Seattle, the Seattle area in October, just in time to be quarantined. So you're catching me in beautiful Issaquah, Washington, actually.
Fantastic. Well, we're really excited to talk with you because, you know, Maryland, like every other state in the union and every other place in the world, I guess for that matter, has been profoundly impacted by, first, of course, the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And now, of course, there's profound, and there always have been, but profound racial justice issues that have been brought to the forefront and are calling to question everything that's going on in small communities across the country. So we want to talk about not only the challenges, but also the opportunities and some of the things that the National Main Street Center is doing and some of the resources that they're providing, which I know even personally we've found very helpful for some of the work we're trying to do here in Maryland. And then if people have questions throughout this, you know, and they're calling in, or not calling in, I guess, but they're commenting from a Main Street community, they can do that. And at the end, we'll try and provide an opportunity to do some Q&A if people are interested. But before we get started, you know, we do a weekly podcast called PreserveCast, and on PreserveCast, we always try to get to know the people that we're talking to first before we dive into whatever topic it is we're covering. And so we'd love to get to know a little bit more about you, maybe some background and what got you here to be leading the National Main Street movement.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks, Nick, for making time and inviting to join you. I'm looking forward to the chat, and I just have to say I'm in awe of everything you're doing at with Maryland, and you have the admiration of many in the preservation field for all the right reasons. So thank you for all of your leadership. So I started my work in preservation really after my first job in college. Right after college coincided with 9/11. I was working at the State Department in DC, and you know, at 9/11, I think a lot of people, you kind of heard about people, that was a moment in which people, they reflected on, you know, am I doing what I really like? And made some changes. And so I definitely fell into that camp. I realized that what I loved the most in college was I took on architectural history, also a little bit of a policy wonk. And so I had this kind of aha moment when I was touring downtown with Michael Sullivan, who's a local preservation hero here in Washington State, where he was talking about historic preservation. And I thought, aha, that's it. That's what I want to do. So from that, I drug my heels a little bit, ended up going to grad school when I was a little bit older, and were really lucky to just hit the trust at right time. I had to work on preservation and sustainability. They were looking for somebody to come in and help them with their sustainability work, and that was my intro to the trust. By the way, I'm getting a message that says the internet connection is unstable. If I lose you, I have another thing I can switch to, and so I'll call right back in. I'm sorry. And then, you know, long story short, the ministry position came open about 7 years ago, and I thought, you know, I have done a lot of work around sustainable communities. I love preservation. I love what Main Street does. And so I threw a name in the hat.
Yeah. And so, and you came to the Main Street Center at sort of a pivotal time and sort of a change. You guys have rebranded and things look very fresh. And there just seems like there's a lot of energy around Main Street. And I know people who talk about going to Main Street conferences, they say it's almost, which I guess hopefully in the future they'll get to have them again, but it's almost like
Hopefully.
it's like a preservation revival experience.
Yeah, it is.
It's something unto itself. And so maybe let's talk a little bit about the Main Street Center, which probably should be easy for you. But for people maybe who are unfamiliar with it, or for people who are running local Main Streets and don't interface a lot with the national side of this, how does it relate to the state local programs? Maybe give us the brief background on how it came to be.
Yeah, well, so of course it was a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation for many, many years. And then in 2013, as you referenced, it was decided that it should really be spun off. So more focus, more attention could be put into it. And quite honestly, so we could grow the movement. And fortunately, I think we've had some success doing so recently, or in those recent years. So, you know, it really started, Main Street really started, I think, as by a group of radicals within the Trust circle who thought, you know, there are all these wonderful buildings in our historic cores that we're losing. This was late 70s, early 80s, where we were right in the thick of everybody moving to the suburbs, and the big boxes hadn't happened yet, but malls certainly had, strip malls. And so it was a real transition point for the Trust to say, you know, America's Main Streets really matter. And we're gonna invest in these programs, and we're gonna help communities bring them back. So we, national organization, we have a network of 39 states that participate in the program, and then four cities that participate, big cities that participate. We at the national level provide, we're probably best known for something called the 4-point approach, which is the framework that now more than 2,000 communities have used in bringing change, bringing more people, bringing businesses back downtown. And our current network is over, we have about 1,800 members, about 1,200 of which are designated Main Streets. Those Main Street programs, most of them when I talk about state coordinating programs, most of them are housed in state government. So often, sometimes they're in a state historic preservation office. That's not the case in Maryland, of course, but that in Kentucky and Ohio, I misspeak about Ohio, but Kentucky and lots of others, there's great representation in the SHPO. And many other instances, it's housed in economic development corporations, like in Michigan, or in your own state of Maryland, it's in the Department of Housing and Commerce. You know, regardless of where those programs are housed, preservation is a core strength that runs through them. This is fundamentally about embracing those older assets that communities have downtown, putting them back into productive use, and you know, making them vibrant again, viable again.
I mean, it was really, I think people oftentimes think of, you know, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, or they think of their SHPO offices, or maybe they think of the National Park Service when they think about historic preservation. But I imagine that the National Main Street Center and its Main Street affiliates almost touch more preservation on a daily basis than probably all of those combined, just because you have so many small communities that make up this network. So I guess those radicals were right. We interviewed Tom Moriarty for PreserveCast a few episodes ago, and sort of talked about where did this crazy idea come from 40 years ago, and how people kind of started taking note and were like, hey, I think there might be something to this. And now even just the term Main Street, I mean, obviously people talked about Main Streets then, but the idea of just Main Street as a place unto itself that sort of has a special need is something that I think that this program sort of even highlighted and brought to the fore. So it's actually even had like a cultural impact on the country. It's interesting.
I like to think so. I mean, they were onto something when they started this 40 years ago. You know, the interesting thing about Main Street is, unfortunately, I think in a lot of communities, you can go in and people will sometimes reflexively shut down when you start thinking about preservation rights or preservation issues. And it's not everywhere, right? But there are some places where, unfortunately, that is the case. Now, often I would say that's because preservation is misunderstood, but the point being, with the Main Street program, and I think the trust saw this, with the Main Street program, there's a way to have a different conversation where you get the same outcome, right? You're preserving these fantastic assets. They are contributing to a sense of character, to a sense of place and history in a community. And yet, in some cases, you can sidestep what can be a thorny conversation.
Yeah, and I feel like we could probably, and you particularly, could go on about the philosophy and theory of Main Street for a while. But I mean, it is interesting that a lot of times all the challenges we associate with preservation and the baggage we associate with preservation and talking about how do we change preservation for the better, in some ways we just need to look to Main Street, I think. And it's like, oh, well, that's how you kind of do it, right? Like they, to the extent that's like, oh, well, we need a different term instead of preservations. What about Main Street? So I do think it's interesting, and it's something that I think all preservationists need to know more about. And so that's why we're so glad to have you here today. Again, for people joining us, we're with Patrice Frey, the president and CEO of the National Main Street Center. And we've been talking a little bit about the background of the center and how it came to be and the work that it does. But let's kind of drill into this moment that we're living through right now, which perhaps is the most profound challenge, threat, impact to Main Street communities since the program came about, which is the impact of the pandemic and COVID-19. So you did a really big survey, which kind of gives us a little bit of data, and I know here in Maryland the data is terrifying. But what did this? How did you do the survey? What did it find? And then maybe we'll talk about what scares you, but also what opportunities might exist from the data you gained.
Well, I wish I could claim credit for the research myself, because I have a little bit of a research nerd streak running through, and I've engaged in a lot of research when I was at the trust. But we have two very talented on staff, Matt Wagner and Mike Poe, actually assisted by some other folks. We reached out to the network, did some very early survey work right after this hit, asking businesses basically, how long can you survive this shutdown? How long can you survive this crisis? And the data was really troubling. We basically heard back, well, when we extrapolated the data, the finding was that up to 7.5 million small businesses are at risk of closure. Those are particularly businesses under 20 people. And those tend to be, your mom and pop businesses that just don't have access to the same resources that a larger corporation would. We also extrapolated that there would be about 30 million unemployed associated with that, unfortunately, and that's 30 million just from the very small business sector. So that's firms that with 20 or fewer people. And unfortunately, as we've watched the unemployment numbers tick up, we've seen a really consistency with what that research predicted. The other things that we saw early sort of evidence is particular strain for women-owned businesses and particular strain for minority-owned businesses. And unfortunately, there have been subsequent studies, one of which came out from the National Bureau of Economic Research earlier this month, that has revealed that this has had it's been terrible for business generally. It's had a devastating impact for Black-owned businesses, for Latinx businesses. That it's a little uncertain whether these are permanent closure, but it's looking like 41% of Black-owned businesses may have dissolved, 32% of Latinx, and just really crushing numbers compared to 22% of the small business universe as a whole. So really an outsized impact to minority groups.
So these are scary numbers.
Very.
And is it an acceleration of a normal business cycle, or is it something altogether different from any normal business cycle?
No, I mean, I don't think there's anything normal about this. And when you were teeing this up and talking about like the most challenging thing Main Streets have ever experienced, I mean, my goodness, I hope in our lifetime this is the most challenging thing we ever see, because this has the potential to be catastrophic. It already has been catastrophic for thousands of businesses that have shutter theirs permanently. Our concern is that, you know, the longer this goes on, the more business failures we're going to see. You know, unfortunately, I think there was kind of sense that as soon as states started to lift the safer at home or stay at home orders, that, you know, business would get more or less back to normal. And that's just not the case. I mean, what we're seeing is consumers don't feel safe, and they are behaving accordingly. Now, that's not everybody. You know, we do see where some people are out and about and having a good time, and but bottom line is we think it's a tough haul over probably the next 18 to 24 months. And so it's not just a matter of, oh, you got to get through the shutdown. It's okay, how are you going to modify your business model or modify your operations? Yeah, in a way that's going to get through the next time period.
So we have some Main Street communities here. Well, we have a lot of Main Street communities here in Maryland, but we have some that have really stood out. Our friend Karen Norman at Downtown Frederick Partnership has done some really fantastic stuff, as have others. I know the folks in Cambridge, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore. You know, they're trying, and there's some real bright spots out there in terms of what businesses are doing to sort of shift their models, and Main Street's helping them make that shift. So you've painted a very gloomy, sad picture. Let's try and pivot best we can to, are there opportunities, and what can be done to sort of push back against this? You guys released something called Main Street Forward. You've released a lot of really good content, but Main Street Forward was something recent. So what is that plan outline? Because that, to me, sort of summarizes your hopes and what can be done.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm painting the picture because of catastrophe, because people need to take this seriously. Now, on the other hand, we have seen where Main Streets and small businesses have responded with enormous creativity and resilience. And those small business owners are going to be the last to pack up and go, because that's their livelihood. That is, you know, that's their community. And so we can get to this a little bit later, but a lot of Main Street Forward is how do we advocate to sustain those Main Street programs. But I think what we've seen is, you know, Main Street leaders are scrappy. And I say that in the best, most complimentary way I can, in that they have used this moment to think in incredibly creative ways about how they're going to help their small businesses. And so, like you've said, it's been a moment where, it's really hard, but they've been able to pivot really quickly. Some of my favorite examples are groups that have raised relatively small amounts of money, but then use that to very quickly help get their businesses online, or very quickly help them buy the PPE supplies that they may need, the hand washing stations and the plexiglass and all that kind of stuff that businesses need. In other cases, Main Streets have been a lifeline in terms of, as I know this is the case in Oregon, in terms of connecting their business owners to state grant programs that are going on, or helping them fill out the PPP application, because for a lot of small businesses, that was really hard to do. So it's been fantastic.
So are there any like big picture recommendations that you guys are putting forward in Main Street Forward that businesses Main Street should be thinking about?
One of the things, there's a planning guide that we released a few weeks back that really encourages communities to look at this in 90-day chunks, if you will. There are surveys of your businesses. There are surveys of consumer surveys that are available on our website. People can access. We think that understanding your business owner's needs, understanding consumer psyche is really important in helping your community tailor a strategy to get through the coming time period. And a variety of other resources available on the website as well. One of them, Main Street Forward is it's a resource online. It's also a campaign. And we're doing a lot of work right now, federal advocacy, trying to secure $100 million in support to make sure that our Main Street programs survive, that they survive at the state level and that they survive at the local level. So that's a massive work doing.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Like, what is the $100 million ask? What would it look like? And if people want to support it, how can they?
Yeah, great question. So at 100 million really divided into two categories, about 75% of that to go directly to supporting Main Street programs at the state level. So that's making sure that we have a total of 44 programs, making sure that they can keep supporting their communities, because the fiscal climate for states and cities is a mess. We know that if it's not public safety, if it's not public health, if it's not education, it's very likely to be cut. This is a play to get out in front of that. It is a dollar for dollar match on a sliding scale to incent states to still support their programs and not pull back that funding. It's a very similar story in terms of threats to budgets at the local level. And so we envision some of that money passing through coordinating programs to the local level to help sustain the budgets of local Main Street programs, which are often, they're usually well diversified, but all of those lines of revenue are going to be threatened in the coming weeks and months and possibly years.
Yeah, they're particularly, here, and I'm sure everywhere, Main Street's put on a lot of events, and those can be the revenue makers for organizations.
Yeah.
So surviving this moment, even as it's tough, because they're trying to support the businesses that make their Main Street communities vibrant, but they in themselves, these Main Street organizations, need to figure out how to keep themselves alive. So hopefully some of them have been able to avail themselves of PPP loans. But, like the challenge here in Maryland is that the state of Maryland provides very little financial support to the Main Street communities themselves. They provide grants for facades and things like that, and there are small operating grants that they can competitively apply for. But it's a real challenge at the local level, particularly in our rural Main Streets. And I imagine that are you finding any difference between the impact to rural versus urban? Is it more pronounced in certain places, or is it just bad everywhere?
It's really interesting because we looked at the data, we sliced and diced it by rural, urban, exactly the same. I would have expected there to be some, I can't tell you exactly what I would have thought it would have looked like, but that there's very little difference. It's a bit surprising.
Right. And I have seen, I think it's the Main Street Center put on a presentation, or there's one coming up on how rural Main Streets can take advantage of sort of work from home. And, if you work at Twitter, you don't have to live in San Francisco anymore. You can move to Cumberland, Maryland.
Yeah, I think that we were starting to see before all of this, where major cities were starting to reach peak unaffordability for most people. And so, I do think there was already a bit of a trend of people, especially moving to still cities, but, what we would call second tier or third tier cities. And now I actually do think there is a real opportunity for rural communities to grab a piece of that. And, people are finding, I think this does usher in a whole new world. So that's one decided upside, I think, of all this.
Right. So with Main Street Forward, is there ongoing research? It seems like Main Street, particularly under your leadership, it finds research important because it can sort of highlight where policy and other impacts should go. Are you guys continuing to do research, or do you have plans for more? What's the story on that?
We do. We are making plans for a third survey. I think we're seeing where there's a lot of survey fatigue. Unfortunately, small business owners have been surveyed. But that said, we are interested in going out there again, and I think asking some questions around, look, over the longer term, what kind of support systems do you need? Because we know that this will be continuing on for a while. So that survey, I think that's going out sometime later this month or very early next. You know, you're right. I mean, my view on research is that it's critical for us to be engaging in methodologically rigorous research that helps inform decision making about what happens on Main Street, whether that's in a rural context or in an urban context.
So I guess I should have asked to, or put a finer point on it, but with the legislative piece that you're asking for, is there a bill associated with it? If people are interested in being supportive, how do they take action on that?
Yeah, you know what, I got sidetracked because there's a second piece of that. It's not just passing through to, so thanks for bringing us back. It's not just going to the coordinating programs. We've also set aside 25% to support small businesses and transitioning online. That's another silver lining, I think, is for businesses that are prepared to go online, enter that world. That ultimately creates a more sustainable business model for them on the back end of that. But, you know, in many cases, people just don't know where to start. They didn't go into business because they wanted to be selling online. And so they're going to need some support services to figure out what's the best platform. You can go to mainstreet.org/speak up for Main Street and sign up to learn more about our advocacy efforts and participate and be an advocate for our work. Right now, the path is a little unclear whether there will be additional legislation. As you probably know, if it happens, it seems likely to happen before August. We've had some very positive conversations, especially in the Senate, with potential sponsors of the bill. So we're very optimistic that this would be included as part of a larger package, probably focused on supporting states and cities who have been just crushed in all of this. And it would very likely be just a support through the appropriations process.
Right. And there's obviously, there's a lot of potential opportunities for the preservation community. I know the National Trust for Historic Preservation and others are supporting expansion. And I know I serve on the National Partners Network, which is the state and local association. And we've been very supportive of trying to expand the Paul Brune Rural Revitalization Grant Program, which is a program that works really well with Main Streets. It provides capital grants for subawards to rural projects. And so that program, I think, currently has like 5 million, and the ask is to get that to 100 million or something like that through the Historic Preservation Fund. So there's more than just, I mean, Main Street is critically important, but there's a lot of pieces to the potential preservation puzzle here. And all of it needs folks' support. I know we have information on our website. If you go to presmd.org/recovery, you can find out the latest information. And we've formed here in Maryland a Maryland Heritage Recovery Task Force, which is focused and has representation from Main Street communities on it, and is focused on making sure that leaders here in Maryland are aware of the needs of this community that has been hard hit, and that represents heritage tourism, Main Streets, museums, and these sort of experiential aspects of the economy that have been hit almost harder than any other aspect. And so I know it's happening at the state, the local, and the federal level. So that's important for people who want to take action on this. And I know we've got people tuned in right now from all across the state, from Howard County and Brunswick and the Eastern Shore. So you talked about breaking up Main Street responses into 90-day chunks, which I think is interesting, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But I'm also curious if you've got any sort of like favorite examples from the field of things that are going as well as they can be right now.
Yeah, I do. I mean, there's just so much good stuff out there. It's hard to pick, but you know, Harrisonburg, Virginia has what they call a bricks and clicks program, and they got early on with this. It's, you know, relatively modest grant program, $5,000 for each, that allows those businesses to either make physical changes to their to their spaces to make them, compliant with health code requirements now, or to invest in getting themselves online, which again, that's like a real reoccurring theme. And actually we were able to give out, it was the Joe and Marge Grills Grant Fund for revitalization and particularly innovation in light of COVID. And so we saw several proposals that were really focused on helping people get online. We've seen others, take downtown shuttles and turn them into delivery vehicles. That we've seen examples of that actually of starting delivery services, particularly in rural communities where you have folks who aren't able to get downtown safely. That's been really great to see. Again, people taking over streets, and this is not just a Main Street thing, it's also local government understanding, all right, things have changed. So, I saw a picture of Evanston, Illinois, where I used to live, where the local Main Street district had commandeered like an entire street. They just shut it down, and now it's really nice outdoor seating for 3 or 4 restaurants there. So it's the list goes on, but it's a really impressive effort.
Yeah, and one of the things I thought that was really cool about the Main Street Forward website and the plan there is that you were very clear about steal these ideas, right? There's nothing proprietary about these ideas, and sort of encouraging people to take what makes sense from some of these things. And I know we have some grant applications pending where we want to provide more support to Main Street communities. So we liberally lifted from different ideas from around the country, but I think it's a great service that you're providing there. So people should check that out. And if you're a Main Street looking for just innovation or ways to use limited resources to make an outsized impact, I think you guys did a great job with Main Street Forward, and it's a resource people should take a look at.
I'm really glad to hear about the just shamelessly stealing ideas, because especially, with all of our content we're posting on COVID, that is what we're hoping people do, and especially with the Grills grants, we would have loved to give out $1 million, but this is fantastic that we can get the ideas out there. People can get inspired by what they can do with relatively small amounts of money.
Speaking of money, you have another program that I just saw announced yesterday that the National Park Service is supporting. Yeah. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, that is the Paul, well, there's actually 2, because there's the Paul Gruen grant funds, which you mentioned earlier today, or earlier in this conversation. That's fantastic. Those are grant funds that are going to rural communities to help them revitalize their downtown buildings, do facade improvements on their downtown buildings. We also we're very fortunate to support have the support of the National Park Service in doing some disaster preparedness planning and work. And so Lindsay Wallace in our office leads that effort. This is really new. We're kicking it off now. The idea when we initially received the funding was that we would use it to develop toolkits for kind of your conventional disasters, right? Your tornadoes, your fires, floods, hurricanes. We've since expanded that. We'll also be looking at developing a toolkit for responding to pandemics now. It is, what I love about it is there's a huge crowdsourcing element of it, which is we want to tap into the expertise folks have had as they've or developed as they've been responding to disasters in their own communities. So yeah, I think there's information on our website, on our blog about that now, and would encourage you to check that out if you're interested in learning more.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that right now, Main Street's preservation organizations, whoever they may be, are kind of looking for every opportunity to apply for funds. And if you can develop an application to something like that, you pretty much have the opportunity then to use that, for a subsequent funder and kind of like develop your ideas now. And, I think looking ahead to 2021 is scary because there's so much unknown. And I've seen polling data that suggests cultural institutions that are inside are places that people are going to be the least comfortable being in until they basically have a vaccine in their arm. And so I'm curious, the numbers that we talked about at the beginning of this, when you extrapolate them out into 2021, this dragging on and on and on, do they get worse and worse and worse? Because you talked about those numbers if it dragged on for, did you say 3 months?
5 months. It
5
was
months.
3 to 5.
So we're already, well, I don't even remember what month is this, but but we're already how many months into this? 4 months, 3 months already. Where are we in 2021? What does the state of Main Street look like then? I know you guys just did a report, State of Main Street, which was sort of a snapshot of where you guys were over the last year. And
yeah, that's kind of what doubles as our annual report and as an annual magazine. It's a good question. So when we did the survey back in March, I think we, like many, thought, oh, this is a 5-month issue. There's probably so I don't have an answer to that question, because that's not what our survey was trying to get at.
right.
There's important survey work to be done. And this conversation is reinforcing it, trying to understand, okay, if we're looking at the long haul here, 18 to 24 months, what is it that you're going to need to stay in business? We've talked about, so I think there's 2 pieces of this and it's related. The federal program, the PPP for Payment Protection Program, for the bad rap it got, it did, even acknowledging that and that there were real problems with it, I've seen where it really was a lifeline for a lot of businesses. The problem was it was calibrated to 10 weeks, right? 10 weeks of payroll, when we know this disruption is going to last much, much longer. And so I think my own sense is that Congress has yet to realize and yet to take seriously that if they care about the survival of small businesses, they're going to have to think about longer term intervention. Part of that longer term intervention is making sure that hyper local support systems like Main Street's survive, right? So they can continue to help those small businesses innovate. They can help connect them to other grant sources, whether it's community foundations or state or city. There's an absolutely essential role that has to be played there. But to your broader question, what does it look like in 2021? Well, I think a lot of that depends on how seriously Congress takes this. I mean, and you got the Federal Reserve Chairman basically saying these businesses are in acute distress. They go away, that's going to have real repercussions on the speed at which the entire economy can recover. So let's hope Congress is listening.
Right, and I saw that there's the P4 Act has been introduced, which is really focused on small business. I think it's employees of 100 or less, and it's basically the PPP Part 2, and it would so there are some policy proposals out there that would extend this further, but the scary thing about the way in which the process in Washington works is that it's so slow, and we need quick action, right? Like restaurants can't survive, and here in Maryland, we're in good weather right now, and so we're able to dine outside and things like that, but we worry about what happens in November. Do people want to still have that wonderful al fresco experience in a Maryland November? So
I have plenty of DC winters, so no.
yeah. So I mean that is a concern about where we head with that. So I know we mentioned that we would try and take some questions, and so I want to encourage folks, if there's anybody out there who has, we've had some. There was one question, or at least a comment, about Main Streets needing to be self-sufficient, and how in certain cases local Main Streets have been spun off by local government to become sort of these self-sufficient nonprofits. In light of everything that's happening right now, is that a concern? And is that where sort of this policy piece comes in terms of infusion of cash?
Yeah, I mean, I think we at the center are pretty flexible in our thinking about where Main Street programs are housed. So you look at some states like Texas, and they're almost all creatures of government, right? That they're in local government. That's often the case. That's similar in Michigan. I would disagree with the notion that Main Streets need to be entirely self-sustaining, which I interpret that to mean don't receive any sort of government funding.
Right.
And I would say, because I think everybody has a stake in what happens downtown, and it is eminently reasonable that local government would invest in creating a quality downtown, and that's what Main Streets do. It is also true, though, that the programs that will have the most resilience for the most part are those with diversified income streams, and so that they're not just relying on government support. They have memberships, they have events. Now the problem in a moment like this is every single one of those is threatened, and that's not necessarily been the case with any past recession or event.
Right, and it's also it's different from a normal disaster, in that normally a disaster hits one part of the country and philanthropy is able to respond to that place. Whereas right now it's hit everywhere, so philanthropy is really strained in a way that it normally wouldn't be. There was a question that came in about the concern about the return to, will we be able, there will never will be a normal again, but what's going to happen? I guess this is a crystal ball question, but what do you sense might happen to Main Street communities, particularly in densely populated areas? Is there a concern that people are going to pull out of these places for fear of the next pandemic, or that these are not places we want to be? I mean, I guess the experience of New York City sort of extrapolated out, right? That was one of our first hot spots. And this is an area where we deal with it a lot. We have a smart growth program under the organization called Smart Growth Maryland, and there's a big push out there that we think doesn't have much to it, that density is dangerous and that sprawl is safer when it comes to pandemics. And does that impact the future of Main Streets?
I don't have a crystal ball, so I could be 100% wrong. I think the answer is no. I don't think we're going to see that people empty out of big cities en masse and want to live in a cabin in the woods kind of situation. My husband's walking in. Hi, I'm on a Facebook live chat. Yeah, okay. Sorry. I do think I think we're inherently social creatures. I think there are things that people have always valued and loved about cities. I'm not sure that, as bad as this pandemic is, that changes any of the fundamentals.
And why do you feel, what makes you think that? Is that it's just too much work to pick up and leave and move, and that people aren't going to do that? Or do we just go back to normal? I mean, I guess this is sort of, we've done some PreserveCast episodes with folks, public history historians, public health historians. We just released one about, well, what happened after 1918? And soon thereafter, people just kind of forgot. I think that might be harder to do in this moment, but is there something there to that? Or is it that the draw of Main Streets is just too good?
I think there's something profound about the draw of cities, and you're calling me on the carpet, and it's good. I mean, I don't have my crystal ball. I could be completely wrong about this, but I think we saw such enthusiasm, such an acceleration of interest from key demographics, and at the total end of the spectrums, right? Millennials and boomers, and coming back to the city. And they wanted it because they wanted walkability. They didn't want to be tied to their cars. They wanted a sense of like character, and I'm in a place that means something. They wanted, unique experiential retail, really a range of restaurants. I guess I would just be surprised if people were willing to let that go because of because of a viral event. But, I've been wrong about plenty of other things in the past.
So we've got a few more minutes with Patrice, and a good question did just come in, which is, summarizing it here. How do we pass the torch? So this person is in Baltimore, in a Main Street community in Hamden, and the Main Street's a big deal, but they're already losing a lot of those businesses, and a lot of them that give it its quirky character. And I can attest, our office is not far away. It's quite quirky in a good way. And some have been there a long time. So how do we help the new ones to be successful? And that's a really great question, sort of looking to the future and to avoid the pitfalls of people leaving Main Streets. How do we make sure, one way or another, we're going to lose businesses. We're already losing them. How do we make sure that the new ones have the support that they need? What do we need to be providing to them?
Yeah. Well, I think it all comes back to a support system and making sure that there's a robust support system in place for entrepreneurs. And Baltimore, I think you were talking about Baltimore there.
Right.
Baltimore is fortunate to have its own Main Street program. It has some very talented leadership. I would say that is your first stop. Main Street isn't everything, right? It can't be everything to everyone, but what we really see, the real strength of the program is in connecting small business owners to what they need, right? So they may need leads on who can provide them capital. They may need leads on even just finding a space, or developing a business plan, merchandising, all kinds of things. And that's where Main Streets play a very big role. Now, I will say that, one of the challenges we've seen, well, first of all, I referenced earlier that it may be that 41% of Black-owned businesses have dissolved over the course of this, which is it's such an astonishing and kind of crushing number that it's hard to wrap your head around that. We also know that rates of entrepreneurship for African Americans, even before this, trailed those of the population as a whole. So about 7% of small businesses are owned by 7% of 7% of African Americans own small businesses, as opposed to, I think it's 13% of the entire population own small businesses. So this is an area where we know that those businesses have been particularly vulnerable, and there wasn't sufficient representation to start with. It makes sense that we're doing this at Street. How do we pivot our resources to make sure that we're supporting small business ownership by people of color in our Main Streets? So I would with humility say, we have not done enough in that space, and we're committed to doing more, and you will see more coming from us in the coming year on that.
What does that look like? I don't want to ask you to give away all of your secrets and plans, but what does that look like? And because I think we all grapple with that statement where that makes sense, but then what does that actually look like? Is it lending programs? Is it entrepreneur boot camps? What actually works? And not just for minority-owned businesses. That's important, critically important, obviously, in this moment. But what just works in general for getting people to take that dive into small businesses? Is there anything that you guys have seen that really is a slam dunk?
Yeah, yes, and there are lots of paths to get there. First of all, it's recognizing that any small business owner is going to need really comprehensive support. So it's not just the connection to the lender. It's not just the connection to, hey, can you help me negotiate this issue with a permit with the city? It's that entire suite of things. One of the sort of easiest paths to entrepreneurship we see is when people start small, right? When they do a pop-up. So many fantastic stories of pop-ups turning into full retail scale, endeavors. That might be one sort of silver lining. When we have more vacant spaces, it creates the opportunity for more of those kind of.
I was going to say, do you think that is this the I mean, it's like the worst time to do a pop-up, but the best time to do a pop-up? I mean, are you guys going to be encouraging that? Should groups like us be going out and renting space and letting people in it? I mean, what would you say about pop-ups? And I know we're supposed to plan 90 days at a time, the Fry rule. But I mean,
No, that's the Matt Wagner rule. You can thank or blame him.
but let's look out to November, December, which is a critical time for businesses. What do you think about pop-ups? Since you brought it up, I'm curious.
I think if it is safe to do so, if it is allowed by your local authorities, you look at the November, December timeline. I mean, why not? People are still going to need to shop.
Yeah, maybe more Chris Kindle marts out in the open.
I mean, you say that a little bit in jest, but I actually think there's really something to that.
No, I was being serious. I was just smiling as I was saying it.
So much more comfortable in the
yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess you were still in mid thought there though. I mean, you talked about pop-ups and other things that can be done for entrepreneurs. So you said it's comprehensive, which to me sounds great, but it also, as the nonprofit executive, sounds expensive. Comprehensive support, right? Or
yeah,
or can you create a toolkit? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, comprehensive means in many cases connecting people to other partners, right? There's a lot that we talk a lot about. You got to stay in your lane, and you can't be everything to everyone. So it's not necessarily that we see Main Streets as providing those services. It's seeing Main Streets as key connectors in that role. And I had another thought there that I just lost. Sorry.
Well, it's fine because we're moving to our conclusion here, and we know your time is precious, pulled in a lot of ways, and running just a really important national group here in the preservation ecosphere. Again, we've been talking this entire time with Patrice Frey, President and CEO of the National Main Street Center. And we started with some background on how you fell in love with architecture and Main Streets and preservation, and then moved on to the challenges of COVID-19 and the potential for pretty profound job losses. We've talked about Main Street Forward, which people should take a look at, has a lot of great examples of things that Main Streets can do right now. And then, of course, the $100 million ask, which is before Congress to really invest in our Main Street communities. And then, we've talked a little bit about steps Main Streets can take today, good examples from the field, again, which can be found in Main Street Forward. You got the new funding program out there that you guys are going to be launching with support from the National Park Service. And, I thought maybe we would sort of wrap with maybe a question or a thought on here in Maryland, since this is a Maryland-based live stream. If you were speaking to Maryland legislators about things that they could do, because obviously a lot of the focus right now is on the federal level, because they're the ones spending the dollars right now. But even though state budgets are going to be hit, they're still, Maryland's budget is still $43 billion. So there's some space in there for Main Streets, perhaps even Main Streets that haven't been supported before, but need critical support at this moment. So if it's a Maryland decision maker, a local politician, a state politician, what is it that they can or they should be doing? Which I'm putting you on the spot. I didn't give you this one in advance.
Well, no. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, first of all, you have extraordinary strength in Main Street communities in Maryland and a lot to be proud of. I don't have it off the top of my head what Maryland's number is, although I know it's similar to this. For every $1 invested in a Main Street program, so every $1 public investment, that leverages an additional $26 of investment from private and public sources. And you are very hard pressed as a decision maker to find another return on investment that comes even close to that. And if you want to just leave out the private investment, you can still see, leave out the public investment, We have studies from several states where $1 will leverage $13 in additional state revenue. So it is one of the most fiscally responsible decisions you can make to support a Main Street program. Now that is the case in normal times. I would say in COVID times, it's even more important because again, these programs are a lifeline for small businesses all throughout the state of Maryland. And quite honestly, we know particularly in a rural context or in distressed urban areas, those business makers or those business owners are making it often against the odds. They have extraordinarily difficult business environment, and it is not often the case that there will be, you know, tons of entrepreneurs right behind them who are going to step in and start up. And so it's worth the investment to save what you have. That's, you know, every time we talk about distressed places, whether it's rural or in the urban context, we always start with save what you have. It is way easier to save what you have than it is to try and create something out of whole cloth after they've gone away.
Yeah, and it's fun to, or fun, I guess, for a politician, but fun to invest in the big, fancy, exciting distribution center and the big giant thing. But really, the bread and butter of communities and jobs comes from our main streets. And so I think, you know, in this coming legislative session here in Maryland and all across the country, we'd be wise to not only be talking to our federal members and federal representatives, but also to state and local, and talk about whether it's redirecting existing dollars or using federal resources that come in to really support this program and programs all across the state. I think today's conversation has been eye-opening about not only the potential for loss, but also the potential for opportunity. This doesn't have to be a moment to wallow in despair. This is a moment to, you know, be scrappy, as you said, pull yourself up and dust yourself off and figure out how we're going to make Main Street communities even better. And we're so pleased to have had you with us here today to have that conversation, and so appreciative of your leadership at the national level. And hopefully when you can travel again outside of your house there in Washington State, you can come and visit us and we'll get you some crabs here in Maryland.
Oh, that sounds great. Although we've got great seafood here, so maybe you should come here.
Okay.
So much. I really enjoy